Buddy, thanks very much for joining us. I know you've got no choice this one. It's either this or wag the entire session, but thanks for coming in to talk about Ukraine. Can we just perhaps have a show of hands of those of you chosen this as your topical legal issue? Yeah, so it's a majority of people in the room. Well, for the others of you, I hope it's interesting nonetheless. I thought perhaps a way to start off, let me first of all welcome Dr. Matt Killingsworth, who's head of the Politics and International Relations Department in the Faculty of Humanities here in the University of Tasmania. Matt also runs the Bachelor of Justice Studies program, and he and I have been doing quite a bit together on current issues in Ukraine. And it's really great to be back together again to talk about this topic this morning. Or actually this afternoon, it's just gone 12 o'clock. I thought perhaps the best way to kick off would just be spend a few minutes on what's happened most recently in the Ukraine situation and in the international community's response to it since the session that was available to you and the pre-recorded material is now a couple of months ago since that event was recorded. Let's just spend a little bit of time on an update. And Matt, how about we start with you? What do you think are the sort of most significant, more recent developments?
Thanks, Tim, and thanks for the very generous introduction. Welcome, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here talking about, as Tim said, a topic that for both of us is a real intersection of the things that we research, that we teach. But as we'll talk about a little bit today, some of the barbarous acts, the crimes, are also things that we take to heart as well, that we are deeply concerned about. So I guess there's a number of ways to sort of talk about since we've last. There's strategically in Ukraine, which it appears that the Russians' folly of sort of having a dual invasion of both through the east and then around over the top through Kiev proved to be strategically silly. And we've sort of reverted back to where Russia or the war is primarily now being fought through the Donbass region. So this is Lugansk and Donetsk on the eastern border of Ukraine and Russia, and then sort of down through the south towards Odessa as well. So that's sort of the strategic part of it. The other aspect of this is that this has become a war in which the West, and when we say the West, this is primarily the European Union, NATO, which includes the Americans and the Canadians, as well as Australia, have insisted that they are all in with respects to support for Ukraine. That means both politically, it also means economically. And so I know I think your question is about sanctions, but it also means with military support as well, short of boots on the ground. And that's really important. So they're all in except, and have made it very clear that under no circumstances at the moment will NATO enter the war between Ukraine and Russia. The other thing that I think is important to mention is that there have been some good news recently. So, for example, there was a blockade in the Crimean Sea, and 2 grain ships have come out recently. One docked in Djibouti yesterday with enough grain to feed 1.5 million people for 3 months. So there was real fear of the importance that Ukraine has as a breadbasket. The wheat wasn't able to especially get to sub-Saharan Africa. So that's a good thing. So I've done politics, done sort of strategy. I think the main part that I'd suggest that the characteristic of the war at the moment seems that it has become attritional, that the war has taken on now a characteristic of small gains made by Russia and then small counter gains made by Ukraine. And as Tim's going to talk about, the other characteristic that hasn't changed is the barbarous nature of the war. Crimes continue to be committed. The nature of those crimes we might talk a little bit more about in detail later, but I think that is a characteristic of the war that has not changed and has been there since day one.
Yeah. Thanks, Matt. I'd add, I guess, in relation to the possibility of war crimes trials, that one, for me, one of the features of the entire war in Ukraine, at least in Western media reporting about it, has been the incredible emphasis on identifying war crimes being perpetrated and on efforts to investigate those and hold predominantly Russians responsible. The prosecutor of the International Criminal Court has been very quick to counter any suggestion that he's only focused on Russian crimes, to say that his office will investigate crimes on the physical territory of Ukraine by whomever or whichever side they are perpetrated. And that's, of course, a very important statement of principle about impartiality, about being prepared to consider the possibility of Ukrainian war crimes as well as Russian. But the rush of the international community, especially the West, to initiate national war crimes investigations, to pour money into international efforts to investigate the crimes, and to characterise what's happening in terms of international criminal law, to me is staggering and unprecedented. I'm quite surprised by it. I know that in The Hague, and I know this because I'm involved in conversations with colleagues in the Office of the Prosecutor, the efforts going on to collaborate with the Ukrainian authorities to investigate war crimes, crimes against humanity and alleged acts of genocide on the physical territory of Ukraine by International Criminal Court investigators is incredibly extensive. There is a team working in The Hague, but there's also an ICC team working on the ground in Ukraine. And it's the latter, the sort of Ukrainian-based team effort that is unusual in ICC experience. Usually there's a team in The Hague that will travel to the country to conduct its investigations, but this is an increase in the allocation of human investigative resources and the finance to make it possible, of course, as well as collaboration with the Ukrainian authorities. And I think that's an encouraging commitment on the part of the International Criminal Court, and we'll wait to see when the first arrest warrants might be issued. There will be a delay for sure in terms of the issuance of arrest warrants and whether or not individuals, the subject of those arrest warrants, can be taken into custody and transferred to The Hague. And the ICC has no jurisdiction to conduct trials in absentia, so they will require the physical presence of any of the accused before trials can happen. We've got, Matt and I have received a number of questions prior to today, some from Marist College, some from Don, and we also had some in from Hobart College. So those of you asked the questions through Jack will be here today, but we really want to make sure we cover some of the questions that have come in from the Northwest Coast, because neither Marist nor Don students are with us. So let's kick off with some of those, Matt. Perhaps we could start with a detailed question from students at Don College. Matt said that in 2014, Russia invaded the Crimea. So actually what's been going on in Ukraine is not something that commenced in March of this year, been going on for 8 years at least. Could Matt elaborate on the invasion of Donetsk and Luhansk? And the reasons for asking this are, and there are several dot points.
Saw those.
Why didn't the West respond to these invasions? If Russia invaded all three, why was it only Crimea that was considered controlled by Russia rather than the eastern provinces of the Donbass? Some people in the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk thought they were being attacked by Ukraine, not Russia. What's that all about? Now in Luhansk, where the people have already been liberated, in inverted commas, there is no bombing, but bombing continues in Donetsk. Is there a reason for that distinction? Luhansk is waiting for Donetsk to claim that they've been liberated before signing with Russia, and there has been support for the population of Donetsk and Luhansk by Russian soldiers since the 24th of February. So, yeah, I'm sure you'll make something intelligible of all of that. Matt's pretty detailed set of comments and questions.
The starting point is exactly what Tim said, that the 2022 war is just the most recent in an ongoing conflict since 2014. The 2014 conflict comes off the back of the so-called Euromaidan protests. And so in 2014, there was a presidential election, and it's in the lead up to the presidential election, the Russian-backed candidate who was about to announce a deal with the European Union went to Brussels and reneged on that deal, and then in turn struck a deal that was very similar to what the Europeans were offering with Moscow. And so as a result of that, there was the Euromaidan protests. The Russian-backed candidate or president was essentially removed from office. And as part of those Euromaidan protests, there were multiple invasions of Ukraine. And so the first question is, why didn't the West respond? The West did respond. The West responded by sanctioning Russia and booting Russia out of the G8. That was the first thing that they did. But as we go on a little bit today, I think one of the key aspects of the limitations of what you can do with Russia is A, they are a permanent member of the UN Security Council, which means they have what? Say it nice and loud. They have veto. So this means that essentially 15 members of the Security Council, 14 can vote for something. If one of those 5 permanent members vote no, it's a no. So Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council. Russia also has nukes. And we can't forget that. Russia is, while it's might be demonstrated that its military is not as advanced or as technologically sophisticated as was originally thought, they still have operable nuclear weapons.
Shitloads of them.
And lots of them, yeah. The question about how many of them work is questionable, but they've got enough. And so in this respect, political responses to Russia are limited in lots of ways by these realities. So these primarily diplomatic responses were sort of what was left in the toolkit. The other one, or the other part of this that is really important, is that in this lead up to 2014, a number of European countries started changing their energy, the way that they supplied energy to their countries. And the Germans in particular started to, or announced they were going to get rid of their nuclear reactors and entered into an almost exclusive deal with Russia to provide natural gas. And so Russia is also an energy superpower. And so the Europeans were caught between the proverbial rock and a hard place. Do we put sanctions on Russia knowing that we're going to freeze in the winter? And so this is sort of the conundrum that the West finds itself in, because post-91, some of you might have seen that Mikhail Gorbachev passed away yesterday, a really important figure in the collapse of the Soviet Union. Post-91, the West embraced Russia, brought it into the fold. And so now the West is sort of finding out, to its chagrin in some ways, that Russia wasn't the friendly ally that they hoped it would be. And so the responses are limited. So why didn't the West respond? They did in the ways that they could. If Russia invaded all three, why was only Crimea considered? All right, this is a bit tricky. It was the Russian army that invaded Crimea. It was little green men who invaded Donetsk and Lugansk. And I say that These were Russian-backed militia. It was not the Russian army. And that's really, really important because essentially it makes one official and the other one gives Russia deniability. So Crimea is official. That's an annexation. Russia has oscillated and denied about their involvement in Lugansk and Donetsk and about their support for militia for a long time. And so the responses were easier against Crimea than they were against militia, supposedly supported by Russia. So that's sort of why there's that tension between official and sort of unofficial responses. And also, I'm trying not to get too complicated here. The further east you go in Ukraine, this is one of those moments we would have loved a map up behind us. The further east you go, there are more Russian speakers. And this is obviously because the borders in those regions have changed throughout the last 200 years often. And so the further east you go away from Kiev, there is more sympathy to Moscow amongst Ukrainians. And so the question of some people in the regions of Donetsk and Lugansk thought they were being attacked by Ukraine, not Russia. This was a really important part of Russia's propaganda machine. And this is what we chatted about in Bernie a couple of weeks ago, sort of the role not only of social media in investigating war crimes, but also the role of propaganda in conflict and the ubiquity of social media. And so that also sort of gets to the question of, and very soon you've probably also seen that the governor of Donetsk and the governor of Lugansk are going to announce their, oh, I've got a map.
I bet you're off now.
All right. So we're in here. So Kharkiv, so basically sort of down through here is Donbass. Donetsk at the top. Ah, there we go. Lugansk, Donetsk. So these are the regions, and where I was talking about the war at the moment. So there's occupied Crimea, and we're sort of looking to establish Russian territory, or the Russians are looking. This is obviously where the nuclear power plant is at the moment that's under attack. Sort of down through here and trying to establish a land corridor that denies Ukraine access to the sea. That's the Russian strategic plan at the moment. So in these regions here, they're about to announce a referendum that in turn will be acknowledged by Moscow, not acknowledged by anyone else, of which they will officially join Russia. So I think that answers.
Thanks for the map, Belinda. It's terrific.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's really great.
So that's the sort of the complicated nature of who's who and what's what with respects to history and with respects to sort of official military and militia involved in those territories.
Got a sort of an associated question from Marist, perhaps while we're on this topic. I think it sort of follows on from it. Why is it the international community now chooses to aid Ukraine? Was it not also a breach of sovereignty to annex Crimea? Of course it was. Is it that NATO feels more directly threatened by Russia now than it did back in 2014?
Yeah, I think that gets back exactly. I think it gets back to the fact that this was a special military operation. Is that what Putin has called it?
Yeah, I don't know the Russian words. But
no,
yeah,
likewise.
English translation.
A special military operation. So this is official Kremlin policy. And so this is something that then can be responded to through official diplomatic avenues rather than sketchy little green men who it's not quite sure who they belong to. So I think that's the part why NATO has responded more formally this time around.
Yeah, and probably also the reason why Finland and Sweden so vehemently independent, neutral, steadfastly refusing to have a countenance joining NATO, all of a sudden jumped on the wagon because maybe it's them next.
Indeed. So does everyone know what NATO is? If you don't, please shake your head vigorously or throw up your hand. And
nobody wants to own up to that now, man.
All right, then.
Now you set them up.
It's the primary security organisation post-Second World War, predominantly all of Europe, the Americans and the Canadians, and it's supported essentially by American military muscle.
Yep. And
and Article 5 of the Washington Treaty says that an attack on one is an attack on all. So the idea of NATO membership means that if now Sweden or Finland gets attacked, there's an obligation for NATO to respond to that. So it's a security alliance.
And that's good hypothetical, isn't it? I mean, would that happen? If Finland and Sweden join and Finland and the Russians decide to invade Finland to test the mettle of the West, not being prepared to put boots on the ground in
you can flip that and
Ukraine,
sort of ask,
what's going to happen?
You can sort of flip that and ask, did they invade Ukraine because they weren't a member of NATO?
Yep.
How
can we decide that anyway in Hobart? You know, you and me up the front, raving on. How can we do that?
We know shit.
Does it matter what we reckon? Let's try something
sometimes. All right. So we've also got a couple of questions about crimes as well, which, as Tim noted in his introduction, have been especially prevalent with respect to this conflict. And so one of the issues that have been raised, and I imagine Tim will sort of go through why this is the case. And this is a question from Marist as well. At times, tribunals have a broader jurisdiction than the ICC. What's the likelihood of a war crimes tribunal being set up to deal with the war crimes in the Ukraine? And I guess that also is understanding the limitations of the ICC with respect to this conflict as well.
Thanks for the question, whoever of you asked it up there in Burnie. But look, the answer is that there's no chance of a tribunal with broader jurisdiction than the ICC being set up to deal with war crimes in Ukraine, and that's because I'm making a distinction here between, on one hand, war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide, and on the other, the crime of aggression. Let me just sort of briefly explain that. The International Criminal Court has jurisdiction over the first three, war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide, occurring on the physical territory of Ukraine, not because Ukraine is a state party to the Rome Statute. It is not because Russia is. Russia is not a state party to the Rome Statute, but because the Ukraine issued a declaration, a unilateral declaration, accepting the jurisdiction of the court after the Russians invaded Crimea in 2014. And that declaration, consistent with a particular provision, Article 12, Paragraph 3 of the Rome Statute, the International Criminal Court, gives to the court the authority, or gives to the prosecutor the authority to investigate war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide as defined under the Rome Statute, Articles 6, 7 and 8 respectively, on the physical territory of Ukraine. Now, the ICC also has jurisdiction over the crime of aggression where certain conditions are met, but the jurisdictional mechanism is different for the crime of aggression. And what we mean by the crime of aggression, not serious violations of the laws and customs of war, not crimes against humanity or genocide targeted at a particular group of people, but the unlawful resort to war. And there's no question that on the definition of the crime of aggression in Article 8B of the Rome Statute, what Russia did in Ukraine from February on is a crime of aggression. In fact, Russia's invasion and annexation of Crimea also is, but the invasion of the eastern part of Ukraine is unquestionably a crime of aggression. But under the Article 15B of the Rome Statute, the jurisdictional mechanism for the crime of aggression, the court, the ICC, only has jurisdiction over that crime where the state involved, the invaded state and the invading state are states parties to the Rome Statute. So you've got this sort of exclusion of the ICC being able to deal with the crime of aggression. And from my perspective, that's the most important crime here, because a lot of what's happened in terms of the wreaking of devastation and destruction in Ukraine, while a lot of it is criminal, a lot of it is also not criminal because it's consistent with international humanitarian law. Some of the attacks have been on legitimate military objectives, and they aren't war crimes. So to hold Russia accountable, criminally accountable, Vladimir Putin and his elite decision makers criminally accountable for the wreaking of the devastation on Ukraine that Ukraine didn't ask for and didn't deserve. We could only really do that in its entirety if we were to, as an international community, able to try Vladimir Putin for the crime of aggression. Now, that's the reason why the international community is talking about the establishment of an ad hoc, so a one-off special international tribunal for the crime of aggression to try Russian leaders for the unlawful, the criminal invasion of Ukraine, because the International Criminal Court is precluded from dealing with that crime. There's no way the international community will set up an alternative to the ICC where the ICC has jurisdiction. There's not going to be an ad hoc international tribunal for war crimes, crimes against humanity or genocide in Ukraine. The international community wants to support the International Criminal Court, but there could well be an ad hoc tribunal for the crime of aggression. I hope that's not too long-winded an answer.
No, it's perfect. Can I ask an ad hoc question?
Yeah, I think you can. I mean, look at all the people you might disappoint who want to ask a question.
My question might be really good.
By you hogging the space. What do you reckon theirs might be terrible? Go for it, mate. Come on.
Who would constitute such a court, Tim? So we've just said that Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council, vetoes such things. So where would the legitimacy for a tribunal come from to investigate crimes of aggression?
Yeah, well, it's not going to come from the Security Council.
Indeed, right.
So there's no way that can happen while Russia's is a permanent member. One option that's being talked about is that the General Assembly of the UN takes a decision by 2/3 majority to approve. So let's understand that while UN Security Council resolutions are binding on member states of the UN, General Assembly resolutions are not. They are recommendations only. But a General Assembly, in circumstances where the Security Council is precluded from acting because of an exercise of the veto power, can step in and make recommendations. And then if the majority of the international community acts on those recommendations, there's no impediment to the legitimacy of what gets created that way. Just we don't have lots of precedents. In fact, none in terms of any substantive tribunal or similar body. But constitutionally, under the UN Charter, that could actually happen. An alternative where the General Assembly didn't get involved, I think a 2/3 majority in the General Assembly would give a greater sense of legitimacy. But an alternative would be a group of like-minded states setting up by multilateral treaty between them an ad hoc tribunal, and they would draw their legitimacy for it from customary international law, which prohibits the crime of aggression as well as genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. So I think it would have less credibility, legitimacy than a General Assembly resolution, but I think the possibility is there.
And we've also got another question from Don as well, and it relates to war crimes. And the question is, how could it be proven that attacks on civilian targets, like the hospital in Mariupol, were deliberate?
Yeah, I really like that question. It's a great question. Thanks for asking it, whoever it was in Devonport that did. And this is an important question because actually for the International Criminal Court to successfully prosecute a war crime, well, especially a war crime involving targeting of a protected civilian object like a hospital or a school or a place of worship or a residential tower, a civilian residential tower of apartments or a residential area, suburb, the prosecutor has to prove beyond reasonable doubt that that was the intended target. So here's the rub, I guess, in terms of limitations of international humanitarian law. The war crime requires the intention to target the hospital or whatever other protected object. And we know from, there are plenty of examples in recent history. The one that comes to mind most forcefully for me in relation to targeting of hospitals is the US Air Force's targeting of the Médecins Sans Frontières hospital in Afghanistan. That hospital was attacked by an AC-130 gunship for 45 minutes. They smashed that place up. They destroyed that hospital. And doctors, surgeons, and patients were killed in that bombing raid. US military, when it was discovered what had happened, US military undertook a very, very extensive investigation, 160 or 170 page investigative report. And they were of the view that it was not intentionally targeted as a hospital because, well, the suspicion is that the Afghani government authorities told the Americans that it was a Taliban headquarters because they were unhappy about Taliban wounded being treated in that hospital, and the Americans were misled as to the character of it. As a consequence of that finding, no one was court-martialed and held criminally responsible because the US, rightfully, in my view, said we have to prove, I'm not suggesting there was no intention, but it is correct as a matter of law that we have to prove that the hospital was deliberately targeted. Now that means that, the prosecutor carrying that burden of proof means that when it comes to the war crime of intentionally directing an attack at a legally protected target, the prosecution has to be able to prove that that place was targeted. And that isn't always easy to do. Sometimes it might be more straightforward than others where there's no military objective anywhere in the vicinity. And I think some of the footage that we've seen of Russian artillery shelling or aerial bombardment of residential areas in major Ukrainian cities is very difficult to imagine how defence would mount some sort of argument. I know we never intended to hit residential areas because we believed that there were Ukrainian, military ammunition stores, personnel housed there, whatever would make that otherwise civilian and protected target a legitimate military objective. It's tricky, but one of the key pieces of evidence that a prosecution is always going to rely on is the absence of any military objective in the vicinity. How else can you explain it? And that doesn't discount the possibility that we're mistaken about the identity. That's a challenge, I think, for the prosecution in these sorts of cases.
We've also got two questions. I'm going to editorialize a little bit here.
Sure.
And they intrigue me because we got a couple of similar questions when we were in the Northwest a couple of weeks ago. And the question is generally around why the focus on Ukraine, whether it's regarding aid, military support, media reporting, and why is that at the expense of other conflicts that are going on in the world? Why not a focus on Yemen? Why not a focus on Myanmar? Why not a focus on Syria? So you and I were quite taken. I remember when we were in Launceston about that question was asked by a couple of people and sort of why does it look the way it looks?
Yeah. Matt and I had a guest session with Newstead College legal studies students, and I think there was some other history and politics students came in to the class, and we had a really good discussion about this. And I confessed then, and will do again to you, that I feel some personal discomfort about this because we know here's the sort of discomfort. What Russia has done in Ukraine, in my view, is reprehensible, it's criminal, and it's right that the international community focuses on the criminality here. And a lot of effort is put into supporting the International Criminal Court in its work. And through the International Criminal Court, in fact, the local investigative authorities in Ukraine, the national authorities. It's right that that happens. And part of me is grateful that the international community is taking it seriously. But the discomfort comes from the fact that why Ukraine and why not also contemporaneously, concurrently, Yemen, Myanmar, the list seems to go on and on. Syria, the conflict in Syria now in its 12th year, which has involved the displacement of well over half the population of Syria, a country of 25 million. Imagine if if more than half of Australia's population had been displaced from their place of residence. You can't imagine the scale of it. And part of the discomfort is me having to accept that there is a racist element to this, that Ukraine is in Europe. They look like us. They look like Western Europeans. And many Western European countries have opened their borders without condition for Ukrainian refugees to flee into. The Australian government announced that we take as many Ukrainians as wanted to come here. Whoa, hang on a second. What about our harsh and bipartisan, by the way, I'm not slagging off here just at the Howard, Abbott, Morrison government, also supported by the Labor Party for decades, a very, very harsh and strict policy about refugee intake and about asylum seekers trying to arrive by boat being shunted into offshore mandatory detention facilities. And now, because Ukraine, this is happening in Ukraine, and I'm not trying to belittle what's happened in Ukraine. It's terrible what happened to the Ukrainians. But they're welcome here, and whatever numbers can make it here. There's something not right about this in terms of wanting to apply the rules of international law systematically, impartially, and consistently. Got a student up the back who wants to.
I'll just add to that quickly. I think similarly, going away from Australia, for example, Poland, that is a country that is governed by a nationalist right-wing government who has been vocal, almost as vocal as Hungary, in its anti-immigration rhetoric, especially with respects from immigrants or refugees in particular, from Africa. And so this, I think, also adds to this idea that there is a double standard occurring here with respect to Ukraine. It's also fascinating. There was a CNN report, and I don't know if he sort of said the quiet bit out loud, where he was comparing the war in Iraq to the war in Ukraine and said, this is different. Ukrainians are civilized. And so I think this also identifies exactly what you were talking about, Tim, that there is a Eurocentrism going on here with respects to the different treatment. Again, not undermining at all the injustices that are going on in Ukraine, but I think it's important to highlight that there is a different coverage and a different response to what's happening in Ukraine than what is happening in Yemen, Myanmar, Syria, Ethiopia. Yeah.
Let's open up the floor for a little bit.
Sure.
We've got some questions from Hobart College here, which I don't know that you've actually seen, but I'm happy to have some.
Tim and
David
Westmore from Rosny College. I'd challenge some of what you're saying. I agree with you. There's a Eurocentrism, and that part of that is geographic proximity. Ukraine's much closer to the rest of Europe than many of those other areas of conflict. But the other ones you cite are pretty materially different to my mind. Yemen, for example, was a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So it's not, you can't really make the case that either country has officially invaded, such as Russia has with Ukraine. So Myanmar is essentially a civil war, as tragic as it is. And many other conflicts there, they might come under Command Article 3, but they're not in the same sort of clear cut than Syria, for example. Another example, a terribly tragic situation, but also sort of proxy war with Russia, the Syrian government backed by Russia, and then the Kurds and others backed at various times by the US and so forth. So I think there is a material difference there. And it's not just about, yes, the Ukrainians are Caucasian like us.
Yeah.
So I think it's a bit more complicated.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, there are some differences for sure. And there's also the question of geography. And I don't think we can dismiss that as a very relevant factor in terms of fear and anxiety in Europe about where the hell else might Putin look next. So I can see that, but yeah, I'd still maintain this sort of sense of discomfort that a civil war like Syria with Russian involvement, it's almost like the strategies that were deployed by Russian military forces, especially high explosive weapons in very heavily residential suburbs of major Syrian cities, is now being replicated in Ukraine. And because of the reaction to the Ukrainian situation, somehow or other that's magnified and emphasized when before it wasn't to the same extent. That I find that very disconcerting. Matt.
Yeah. Did you want to open up to the floor?
Yeah, let's do that. Yeah. Oh, what's your name?
Emily.
Emily from Collegiate.
Yeah. Could we see a reason for such involvement from international community due to the Cold War and the Soviet Union's involvement, and also the fact that Russia and America particularly are two major international powers?
I think this is a really good question. That you're right to identify the symbolism of this conflict, that the Cold War didn't end that long ago. There is a palpable fear about a return to an international order that's underpinned by fear of nuclear war. And so part of the focus sort of, and I don't want to undermine the argument that Tim and I just made, part of the focus on this conflict is because it does involve Russia. It does involve NATO to different degrees. And so the history is important. And I think that's why there is a focus on this, because this is, for all intents and purposes, an imperial power, Russia, who most people thought had sort of sunk away into nothing. And then all of a sudden it comes back in Syria.
Roaring back. And it comes back again in Crimea. And all of a sudden, that all of those ideas about Russia as sort of a hobbled superpower, and all of that language about Cold War, fear of nuclear weapons, superpower, because this war is essentially about nothing more than wanting something that they don't have. You can talk about the existential threats that Putin has spoken about. He's an imperialist, nothing more than that. So he wants it. There's a question here that feeds into that. If he gets it, he'll probably go other places as well. And this idea of sort of the Russian Empire, a bit different to the Soviet Union. This idea of Ruski Mir, the Russian world. And this is what Putin wants. So I think you're really insightful to sort of think about the historical aspects of why we are so concerned about this particular conflict. In the middle there, just wait for the microphone if that's okay. Sorry?
Recorded?
Yeah.
Okay.
What's your name?
Alora.
Laura, thanks.
In terms of Putin's claim of Nazism within Ukraine, how much would that legitimize his invasion of Ukraine, and does it really affect the legal stand?
Short answer is no, but Matt will give you the more comprehensive answer. Nazism in Ukraine, is it fair income or is it just rubbish?
It's generally rubbish. There is a far right wing aspect in Ukraine.
There is in Australia as well, mate.
Indeed. Increasingly, there is in the United States as well, in lots of places. The reason why this resonates so much, and this is something we chatted about in Bernie a little bit, the messaging from Putin often has multiple audiences. This one about denazification is for a Russian audience primarily, because at the end of the Second World War, there were Ukrainians who joined up with the Germans to fight against the Russians, fight against the Soviet Union, primarily with a deep memory of the Holodomor, which was the Ukraine famine, which was a Moscow initiated. And so the idea was that they would fight with the Germans who overthrow the communists. I mean, lots of that went on. So this is why this resonates. But I mean, one could argue that there are in fact more Nazis in Russia than there are in Ukraine. But so, yeah, it's, as Tim said, it's mostly bollocks. But again, it's for a domestic Russian audience to justify the conflict.
Got another question from Hobart College came in this morning, I think, or late last night. what precedent does a conflict set in the international community? For example, the future conflict and the lessons that are drawn by other superpowers such as China about what they can and what they cannot get away with. Like that question. That's why I added it in. Yep. Thanks, Joe.
So this is primarily, I assume, related to Taiwan, yeah?
Well, one could say possibly Taiwan, yeah, but not only.
So much of the commentary around the Russian invasion of Ukraine at the time was, will this embolden China to reclaim Taiwan? And I think there are some important differences here, and that President Xi has said that it is a goal of his to reintegrate Taiwan with China. I think the other important difference, and this is again in no way to sort of belittle the plight of Taiwan at the moment, that Ukraine is an independent nation, sovereign state. Taiwan doesn't have that recognition in the international community. That doesn't make it lesser than, but legally it becomes more problematic and politically it becomes more problematic. I imagine there would be less inclination for the West to intervene in the way that they have been inclined to intervene with respects to Ukraine. But I don't think it emboldens China any more or any less, because they've always been, especially under President Xi, they have always been emboldened about reintegrating Taiwan back into China.
Yeah, maybe I think from an international law perspective, I think this is a really good question. What are the lessons here? Because on one hand, you could say that what does it mean for a normative prohibition? So an international law claiming that it is not only unlawful, but criminal to engage in the unlawful invasion of another country. If the international community does nothing to stop what Russia's doing, what does it do for the normative value of that prohibition? If the rest of the international community says, well, it's Russia, they're a very big power, they've got nuclear weapons, there's nothing we can do about it. And I think that's really part of, or a key driver for those who are arguing strenuously for the establishment of an ad hoc tribunal for the crime of aggression, because we really need to stand up as an international community in favour of, in support of the prohibition on the use of illegal force, which Russia has dramatically violated. But on the other side, you could say, what does it do for the norm if you set up a tribunal like that and it fails? It fails in the sense that, it's all set up and Vladimir Putin can never be captured and taken into physical custody to be tried. What does it do to the normative prohibition if a tribunal established for the purpose of holding Russian leaders criminally accountable actually never happens, never materialises in the sense of the conduct of trials and the holding of individuals criminally accountable? And there's also another issue, I think, in relation to this, and that's about, what about the selectivity here? If we do it for Russia, but we're not prepared to do it when the US and its allies invade Iraq, for example, arguably in violation of international law, what does that say about the normative value of the prohibition if it's only applied against the people we don't like, rather than consistently to everyone who allegedly violates it? So, yeah, some big challenges, I think, in terms of the precedent from Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the international community's response to that for key international law principles and standards. Unfortunately, I'm really sorry, but it's we've got to go to lunch, and there's a whole stack of people who didn't get to ask the questions that they wanted to. Well, we have, but I've got to give some time for instructions.
We've got to talk about sanctions.
Or we'll say something about sanctions in 90 seconds. Time starts now.
This is your question, isn't it, for your special legal topic?
Yeah, they're all wondering why the hell we're taking till now to talk about it. Get on with it, Matt.
You've been the chair, mate. Sanctions are a blunt instrument. The problems with sanctions are that they often affect the people that they're not aimed at. So the sanctions in Russia will most likely affect the average day person, who will find that there are no longer bread on the shelf, petrol in the service station, that type of thing. The other problem with sanctions against Russia is, again, especially with respects to energy sanctions, you're biting off your nose to spite your face, especially for the Europeans who have engaged and integrated so deeply their energy sufficiency, so their energy provision from Russia. They have to be very careful with any sanctions on the energy supplies. The other aspect of this is that there are suggestions that the sanctions are hurting Russia financially, that they've defaulted on loans, that they have also moved to a new form of conscription, and there are other suggestions that they are running out of weapons as well. So again, it's a question about sanctions is who do they impact? How long can you continue to use them? And do they have sort of a negative impact on those who are issuing the sanctions? These are the things that you might want to think about if you're answering that question.
Got a little bit of a reprieve, Matt. The Russians have cut off the gas supply to the barbecue out there. So we've got we've got extra few minutes.
Who's tucking off to the servo to get a new gas?
No, they're onto it. But it's just going to take an extra few minutes. So now we can take a few more questions. And when I get the nod that we're good to go on lunch, I'll let you know. So let's have. Oh, okay. Yeah. All right. Where's the other mic? Can you have that to the woman in the mask just here, Nat, in the second row? Because she has also been eyeballing me like that is so unfair. This is my interpretation. I could be totally wrong, but let's start with you first.
G'day, I'm Oscar from Hobart College.
Thanks, Oscar.
Talked about this a little bit in the last one, but we've already seen, I think you've said pretty clearly that the invasion of Ukraine is pretty clear-cut in international law as an illegal act of aggression, and that it's the kind of obvious invasion that we haven't seen probably since the invasion of Kuwait, I'd say. But you know, but unlike, but you went over very quickly at the beginning that there was no possibility of actual military reaction at all, and that was mostly because of fear about energy, nuclear war, everything. What does this sort of deference to the power and force and the acceptance of the craziness of the Russian regime, what does that actually say about how real this international law is?
Yeah. Thanks, Oscar. There's no doubt in my mind that there is a legitimate basis for any state that wanted to deploy forces to support Ukraine, because Ukraine is entitled under Article 51 of the UN Charter to use force in self-defense against an invasion, an unlawful invasion, and any state in the international community or any group of states is entitled to come in on the basis of what we would call collective self-defense in support of Ukraine. So there's a clear legal basis for any military support, but no one wants to put troops on the ground. No one wants to put planes in the air. No one wants to drop bombs. And I would say, if I was prepared to be honest and put myself in the position of a senior Australian government decision maker, do we want to be the target of Russia's intercontinental ballistic missiles? Their missiles will reach anywhere on Earth, including Tassie, and they're capable of being nuclear tipped. And is this person, Vladimir Putin, who you describe as crazy, and I agree, are we really confident that he wouldn't do that? So that's a big risk, and has to be part of the calculus of any country that says, will we or will we not? How far can we go? How far are we prepared to go in support of Ukraine? We've got the legal authority to do it, but politically, in terms of our obligations to our own civilian society, how far are we prepared to go? Now, of course, we can characterize that as deference to power. But those who exercise decisions about power and how it's used have to live with the consequences of their decisions. So I sort of understand. I mean, this is a huge dilemma. We're not happy with what Russia's done, but are we prepared to actually become belligerence on the side of Ukraine and run the risk of escalation to nuclear war, that you need to think that through. You would have to think that through.
To play devil's advocate for a little bit, because I do agree with Tim, but going back to your point, Oscar, so for example, the UN Human Rights Commission today has released a report that suggests that China is committing crimes against humanity against the Uyghur at the moment. That the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court has announced that he is no longer going to be investigating the activities of Americans with respect to the Afghan situation at the ICC. So I think there are also plenty of examples and counterexamples of the degrees where powerful states are able to dodge their obligations under international law with little to no consequences, like real consequences. But other than, as Tim said, there is, and I think there is an increasing expectation that the existence of those laws gives us something to hold them account to.
Of course, we can ask the question about efficacy and say, are we really kidding ourselves? Those of us who, made a career out of international law, we're just kidding ourselves. This isn't really effective. Doesn't work when it comes to crunch. And I'm prepared to concede that, there are big frustrations with the lack of systematic, consistent, comprehensive application of key legal principles. I would characterise it as international law being an immature or less mature system of law than a domestic legal system where compulsory adjudication is imposed by the powers and structures of the state. Does that mean it isn't law? No, just think it's at a different stage of its progressive evolution. The best test for me would be to say in 2022, how do we compare as an international community with 1922? Has there been any progress in terms of the development of international legal institutions and their effectiveness? Yes, indeed, there have. And maybe the key driver in the future for international law becoming more effective will be existential threats to the existence of the planet. And that will become such a big deal that the international community has to cooperate together, has to agree to limitations on behaviour, because the alternative is self-destruction of the one planet we inhabit. To you, waiting patiently all this time. What's your name?
I'm Mahal from Elizabeth College.
Hi, Mahal.
I wanted to ask a question about the nuclear power plant and the fighting surrounding the nuclear power plant, and if there is the possible threat of a nuclear disaster such as what we see happen in Chernobyl. Is there any possible way that there will be laws or such things created around it to stop Russia from fighting near places like that, to stop a massive disaster?
Yeah, thanks, Mahal. It's a good question. There are already, so under the law of targeting, which is captured in Additional Protocol 1 of 1977 to the 4 Geneva Conventions, it's the key multilateral treaty that sets out the rules on targeting. It's prohibited to target an installation that contains forces that, once released, will pose a massive threat to the civilian population. And that provision specifically extends to nuclear power plants and dams and dikes holding large bodies of water back from inundation. Because if you launch attacks against them, you can't control the consequences that flow from attacking them. But it's also prohibited to place forces around them to remove, in an attempt to remove their legal protection from attack, because by placing military forces around them, you are giving the opposing side the legitimacy to undertake the attack, which would otherwise be prohibited because of the forces that or radioactivity that will be unleashed from attacking a nuclear power plant. And Russia, I think, is aware of that, and they're almost like they're tempting Ukraine to come on, take us on, and if you do that, then you'll be the ones responsible for unleashing radioactivity in large amounts. So, yeah, there's a war crime being committed, one that perhaps we would think, the media wouldn't report as much in terms of its criminality, but one certainly over which the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction. And, well, I know for a fact, I had a chat to the Special Advisor on War Crimes. I speak to him every day. I live with him because I am him. I know that that's an issue that we're considering. That's as much as I can probably say.
In answer to your other question, yes. There is a fear. The International Atomic Energy Agency is sending inspectors there at the moment, and there is an understanding that they will have safe passage to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. So I think you've also got to be just a little bit wary. There are suggestions that both parties might be mistreating that particular plant in ways that would violate international humanitarian law as well. But it is a genuine fear enough that there was a Security Council meeting about it 3 days ago. And again, that their main the International Atomic Energy Agency is sending inspectors there.
Any other questions? We'll take one more up there, Ella. Well, I'll let you answer it, man. I'll go and check on the state of play for the Russians and their gas.
All right.
Sorry, I'm Thomas from Launceston College. In the Yugoslavian Civil War, we saw, well, I didn't see it, the establishment of United Nations, I believe they're called safe zones, backed up by the UN peacekeeping forces. Do you expect any similar safe zones to be established in Ukraine, potentially around nuclear reactors and stuff like that?
I think the safe zones that we've seen have been so-called humanitarian corridors that have been set up. And this has been monitored by both the UN and, really importantly, the International Committee of the Red Cross as a neutral actor. The issue with these particular humanitarian corridors and safe zones, unfortunately, is that Russia has demonstrated itself again and again and again to be a bad faith actor, where they will announce that we will give you safe passage through these regions, and then inevitably target those regions as predominantly civilians are moving through them. So the longer that this war, and this has been the request by Ukrainian President Zelensky, is you'll see him regularly sort of encouraging civilians to leave areas. So I think now there's the possibility of those safe zones, again, I think are undermined by that bad faith actorness of Russia. But again, there are various attempts to be able to do it, especially by NGOs. Yeah.